You exercise regularly, you eat reasonably well, you probably sleep okay most nights, and yet your brain still isn't doing what you need it to do. You're not underperforming because you're unfit, and you're not struggling to focus because you're lazy. And it's definitely not because you're not trying hard enough. Something else is going on, and that's what I want to talk about today. I'm Gavin Evers. I'm a strength conditioning and rehabilitation coach and cognitive performance specialist. I work at a private hospital in Harley Street, and for over 2 decades, I've worked with professional athletes, actors, executives, and busy professionals who all wanted to think clearly, perform consistently, and get the most out of themselves. Now, I had a client a few years ago, C-suite, late 50s, at the top of their game, you know, the kind of person who had genuinely helped build the business that they were part of. You know, they trained 5 or 6 times a week. Their nutrition was really good. They looked after themselves, and honestly, they looked amazing for their age. But they were exhausted, you know, persistently, chronically exhausted. They kept getting sick, not dramatically, but just like a constant low level something, you know, a cold that wouldn't quite clear, a throat that wasn't always slightly off, you know, energy that fluctuated wildly for no real obvious reason. And the motivation for work, which had, you know, for many years been one of their defining qualities, had become unpredictable. You know, some days they were razor sharp and decisive, operating at their best, and other days they just couldn't be asked. When they were on, they were brilliant, but they couldn't control when that was, you know, and they couldn't understand why. From the outside, this person had everything, you know, they had everything covered. They were fit, successful, disciplined, so what was the problem? Well, the problem was that they were doing the wrong exercise at the wrong intensity with the wrong approach. And nobody had ever explained to them what that was actually doing to their brain. Now, here's what was happening physiologically. You know, your body has a stress response system. And when you encounter something stressful, you know, a difficult conversation, a tight deadline, or a heavy squat, your body releases cortisol. Now, that's your primary stress hormone. And in the short term, it's great. It's really useful. It sharpens your focus, raises your blood sugar, mobilizes your energy. It prepares you to deal with whatever's in front of you. Now, the problem comes when that system never gets switched off. So your HPA axis, or your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is the system that regulates your stress response, it's all just stress. You know, a brutal training session and a brutal board meeting looks identical. It all adds to the same pile. So if you're a senior professional dealing with high stakes decisions all day, difficult conversations, you know, the weight of everyone's livelihoods on your shoulders, the pressure of performance, and then you go to the gym and do a brutal high intensity exercise session on top of all of that, you're not releasing stress, you're adding to it. When you do that repeatedly over weeks and months and even years, without giving the system time to genuinely recover, something gives, right? Something starts to break down. Your immune function drops, your hormonal balance shifts, your motivation and mood become unreliable, and your sleep is lighter than it should, even though you're spending 8 hours in bed. And this is what was happening to my client. You know, they weren't unfit, they were overtrained and under-recovered in a body that was also trying to carry the full weight of a demanding professional life, you know. Making super fit their main priority, in their case, was actually making everything worse. Now, I want to share something that I don't really hear many people talking about, because I think this is really important for coaching. Over 2 decades of working with people one-on-one, I've developed this kind of habit, you know. Every single session, before we've even touched a piece of equipment, I ask my clients how they are, you know, how's their day been? They think that I'm making small talk, but I'm not. I'm actually collecting information. In those first 60 seconds, I'm reading everything, you know, their posture. Are they holding tension through their shoulders, their jaw, you know, maybe their lower back, their energy, you know, is it flat? Are they scattered or kind of wired? Looking at their eyes, how they respond to a simple question, whether, you know, I'm fine actually means I'm fine, or whether it means I don't want to talk about anything at the moment, I'm hanging on by a thread. Now, it's a bit like being in the clinic or hospital that I work in. You know, I can often learn far more about a patient's musculoskeletal state from watching them walking down a corridor, you know, back from the toilet or something, than I can from any formal assessment. You know, the way someone moves when they think that nobody's evaluated them tells a lot. Now, I'll ask specific questions like, how did you sleep? How was the meeting you were nervous about? How are things at home? How was that big trip that you were just on? And based on what I hear and what I observe, I make a decision about what we're actually going to do that day. Because sometimes, quite often, the session that I had planned might not be the right session anymore. Kind of think about a client coming in on a Thursday. The week has been brutal. They barely slept, straight for a difficult board meeting or something. Things are stressful at home. Maybe they've come in because they're disciplined and they've booked a session, and they're not the kind of person who cancels. The session that I had planned for them, it's gone before we've even started. Instead we focus on movement, not intensity, not PBs and load, but movement. When someone is carrying that kind of stress, they're often physically tight, holding tension through the hips and thoracic spine, through the shoulders. So we might work on rotation. I might incorporate single leg and single arm exercises that require a little bit of coordination and a little bit of concentration. Something that gently engages their brain without demanding anything too much from a system that's already running at capacity. I'll try and hold a conversation all the way through. Keep it light, keep it flowing, because that social connection and the rhythm of talking while moving does something genuinely useful for the nervous system. Sometimes I'll move the whole session onto a reformer bed, or maybe even just take it outside if we can. And they leave feeling better than when they came in. Not crushed, not depleted, better. And honestly, I think that's what coaching is all about, and the difference between that and just following a program, regardless of what's happening in someone's life, I think is enormous, and hopefully because of that, my job will be safe from AI for a few years anyway. Understanding what state someone is in physically and mentally, and then helping them understand it themselves, is the key to continuous health, fitness, and optimal cognitive performance. You need to know when to push harder and when to slow down, and that's a skill that most people have never really been taught. So what does this actually mean for you? If you don't have a coach with you every session who can kind of make that sort of assessment, well, start paying attention to your own signals before you train. Not what the program says, not what you had planned. What state are you actually in today? Your energy, your sleep, your stress load from the week. These things are really important, and they should influence what you do. Not get ignored just because you have a plan, and you want to stick to it. Now, intensity is a tool. It's not a target. High intensity training is really valuable, but it's not the goal of every session. A hard session on top of a hard week, on top of a hard month, is not discipline. It's a drain on the system that is already very little left to give. Think about your total stress load, not just your training load. Your body isn't dividing your life into work stress and gym stress. It's responding to all of it as one thing, which means on a week where work is genuinely demanding, the right training might be less intense, not more. A long walk, some mobility work, a lighter session that moves the body without pushing the system. Now, that's not taking it easy. That's intelligent management of a finite resource. Finally, recovery is not the absence of training. It is something you do actively and deliberately. Sleep, nutrition, movement quality, the ability to genuinely switch off. These aren't optional extras. They're the foundations that everything else is built on. My client, by the way, if you're interested, once we restructured their training around what their body actually needed at any given time, rather than what they thought they should be doing, everything changed, honestly. That persistent illness, that went. The energy stabilized, the motivation for work came back, and it stayed back. They still trained hard, when that's what their body needed, but they trained intelligently the rest of the time. And the difference to their cognitive performance was, in their own words, incredibly significant. Getting fitter is not the same as performing better. That sounds like it shouldn't be true, but honestly, it really is. And for a lot of people watching this, who are driven, disciplined people who are putting real effort into their health, the missing piece isn't more, it's smarter. Understanding what your body needs, when it needs it, and why, that's not a fitness conversation, that's a performance conversation. And it's one I think more people should be having. And if you want to understand where your own physiology might be working against you, I've put together a free 3-minute assessment that looks at exactly this, how you move, how you eat, how you recover, and how it's all showing up in your daily performance. And I'll put the link below. And if this kind of thinking resonates with you, the newsletter is where I go into it in more detail every week. Real, practical, no filler. You can subscribe in the link below.